Julian Vance rose from his seat in the silent War Council chamber, his shadow cutting entirely across the glowing blue tactical displays. He did not look at the decorated ascendancy generals. He stared directly down the furious sovereign of the Valyrian ascendancy, Queen Regent Vespera. His voice carried no polite diplomatic modulation. He declared he would shatter the entire United Sol Federation alliance before he ever stood by and watched a civilian massacre unfold in the outer systems. Then he turned his back on the throne and walked out. No one intended to document the fracturing of an empire, but watching a single human dismantle centuries of protocol forces a quiet, terrifying confession of complicity from any observer paying attention. 32 orbital cycles earlier, the threat of human intervention had seemed entirely theoretical. Assistant Thalan stood near the western archway of the grand reception hall, holding a tray of ambient temperature hydration spheres, tasked with monitoring the peripheral, physiological needs of the incoming Terran delegation. Princess Kalia stood rigid at the center of the elevated dais. The princess endured these arrivals as a matter of transactional survival. Her vow to never marry was public, legally binding, and the singular shield protecting her autonomy from her mother's relentless political maneuvering. She had spent the morning reviewing the delegation roster on her private console, her subdermal resonance ridges maintaining a steady, calm indigo as she systematically searched for anomalies within the human ranks, looking for any variable that might disrupt the carefully curated stability of her mother's political theater. She had singled out Julian Vance almost immediately. He was an anomaly, an unranked civilian advocate lacking standard diplomatic credentials, inserted into the United Sol Federation vanguard without a clear designation within the ascendancy's rigid hierarchy. During the formal welcome ceremony, the air in the Great Hall hummed with the synchronized harmonic frequencies of the Ascendancy Praetorian Guard. The human delegation marched in absolute lockstep, a gray and silver column of severe military discipline. Julian Vance walked near the rear. He wore a coat of synthetic weave that looked painfully heavy in the humid climate of the capital. With the highest tier of protocol dictated absolute stillness from all non-essential personnel. When the heavy ceremonial banner near the eastern pillar snapped its moorings, it began a rapid, lethal descent toward an elderly palace servant. The human did not calculate the political cost. He simply broke formation. He abandoned centuries of meticulously choreographed protocol to physically intercept the falling velvet, absorbing the crushing weight against his own shoulder while hauling the terrified palace servant entirely clear of the designated impact zone before the heavy fabric could shatter the older ascendancy citizens' fragile crystalline bones. Thalan watched Princess Kalia closely from his position by the archway. She was going to reprimand him for breaking the welcome formation. No, her posture was completely wrong for a reprimand. Her resonance ridges flared a brilliant, chaotic silver. This was an involuntary physiological response to an impossible variable she could not categorize. The human had ignored the throne entirely to look at the servant. He knelt on the polished floor, checking the frail ascendancy citizen for injuries with entirely unearned familiarity. Queen Regent Vespera did not share her daughter's silent, stunned fascination. By the third day of the summit, Julian Vance had become a persistent irritation of the crown. He bypassed the curated tourist zones. He ignored the grand architectural achievements of the capital city. Instead, he carried a ruggedized data pad through the lower transit hubs, interviewing maintenance casts and documenting the unvarnished reality of the labor sectors. The Queen ordered Kalia to intercept the human. Her directive was to distract him with royal attention before he unearthed the structural exploitation holding the outer systems together. It was a calculated deployment of the princess as a pacification tool. Thalon was assigned to trail them at a discreet distance, carrying an emergency medical kit as a flimsy pretext for his continuous presence. He followed Kalia as she cornered Julian in the western public gardens. The air here was thick with the scent of crushed petals and synthetic ozone. "Advocate Vance," Kalia said, her voice dropping into the low, resonant register of formal ascendancy command. "You are straying exceptionally far from the designated cultural exchange parameters." Julian did not look at her crown. He did not look at the intricate ceremonial armor plated across her narrow shoulders. He kept his eyes fixed on the glowing screen of his datapad, his thumb scrolling through endless columns of raw data. "Your cultural exchange parameters are a perimeter fence, Princess," Julian replied, his voice flat, completely devoid of the trembling reverence the Ascendancy citizens were biologically conditioned to project. "I am trying to understand why your agricultural sectors have a mortality rate that your government officially classifies as a rounding error." Kalia stiffened. The ambient temperature around her physically dropped by 2 degrees. It was a defensive thermal contraction unique to the royal bloodline when confronted with severe insubordination. She attempted to leverage her immense presence. She reminded him of her station, subtly implying that she was not bound by the usual transactional obligations of her peers. Assured that she was an independent entity holding her own court. Julian finally looked up from the screen. He studied her face for a long, silent moment. "I don't care about your vows, your availability, or the metal on your head," he said, the sheer bluntness of the statement cutting through the heavy, perfumed air like a kinetic blade. "I care about the people breaking their backs in the dark so you can stand in this light." Just behind Julian's left shoulder, a silver-veined bioluminescent fern reached the apex of its brief blooming cycle. A single glowing blue spore detached from the underside of a curved leaf. It drifted downward in a slow, lazy spiral, illuminating a patch of damp gray stone before blinking out of existence. Thalon watched the spore fade. He found himself entirely transfixed by the tiny death of the light, while the foundation of Kalia's worldview fractured in real time. She did not summon the guards. She did not speak. Instead, Kalia stepped closer to the human. Her thermal signature began to rise, the cold shock of his dismissal replaced by the terrifying warmth of genuine, unstructured curiosity. "Show me," Kalia whispered. The command was stripped of all royal authority, just raw, bleeding need. Julian nodded slowly. He slipped the ruggedized datapad into his coat pocket. He turned and began walking toward the service elevators that led down into the subterranean transit networks, the hidden veins of the city that the royal family officially ignored. Kalia followed him into the dim utilitarian corridors, her ceremonial armor scraping softly against the narrow walls of the service passages. Thalon remained 30 paces behind them, his own bioluminescent ridges dimmed to a dull, bruised purple to avoid detection in the gloom. The descent into the lower labor districts took over an hour of silent, rattling transit on a rusted cargo tram. The polished white stone of the upper city gave way to stained durasteel and the rhythmic, deafening thrum of atmospheric scrubbers fighting a losing battle against industrial particulate. The citizens here did not wear the vibrant silks of the upper tiers. They wore heavy protective canvas, their resonance ridges permanently darkened by chemical exposure and chronic exhaustion. Julian guided the princess through the crowded, narrow walkway suspended above the roaring coolant rivers. He did not shield her from the sight of children working the sorting belts, their small hands moving with desperate mechanical precision. He did not speak. The unvarnished horror of the empire spoke loudly enough. Kalia stopped near a railing overlooking a massive smelting pit, staring down at the workers hauling raw ore without proper thermal shielding. The heat rising from the pit was intense, but Kaelia's core temperature continued to plummet, her physiological response to profound shock driving her into a dangerous, involuntary hypothermic state. She was complicit. The realization did not arrive as a sudden epiphany, but rather as a slow, agonizing, crushing weight settling directly onto her chest cavity. Every meal she had eaten, every diplomatic victory she had celebrated, and every moment of hard-won autonomy she had claimed for herself had been purchased with the blood and labor of the beings suffering in the darkness beneath her boots. She could not look at the workers anymore. She turned her head sharply, locking her gaze onto the crude, synthetic weave of Julian's jacket. The stitching near the shoulder seam was uneven. A single dark thread hung loose, vibrating slightly in the heavy, hot air currents rising from the smelter. She focused on that tiny, imperfect thread with desperate intensity, analyzing the human manufacturing techniques, mentally critiquing the durability of the fabric, doing absolutely anything to deflect the crushing tidal wave of guilt threatening to drown her. The rusted cargo tram began its agonizingly slow ascent back toward the polished, suffocating atmosphere of the upper tiers. In the mechanical grinding of the gears was the only sound permitted in the heavy, humid air of the carriage. The journey took 47 minutes. Every rotation of the wheels carried us further from the toxic, coolant rivers and closer to the pristine falsehoods of the royal court. Princess Kalia stood entirely motionless by the reinforced glass window, her posture stripped of its usual curated grace. She watched the sprawling subterranean shadows pass by, her thermal signature locked in a concerning state of near hypothermia. Her core temperature refused to stabilize. The biological shock of recognizing her own complicity had fundamentally altered her internal regulatory systems. Julian Vance stood on the opposite side of the tram. He did not offer empty human platitudes. He did not attempt to soften the psychological trauma of her realization by filling the suffocating silence with useless apologies. He simply allowed her to stand in the wreckage of her own worldview, granting her the terrifying respect of facing the unvarnished truth without a diplomatic filter. He watched the rusted walls slide past, his expression carved from the same unyielding gravity that anchored his entire species. I observed them from the rear of the carriage, updating my internal medical logs with a profound sense of dry, detached resignation. I began mentally reciting the internal ascendancy protocol for detaining an insolent foreign diplomat under the Sedition Act, preparing to summon the guard. I dropped the thought entirely. The human had angled his ruggedized datapad toward the dim light, revealing the raw labor statistics, pointing in the sheer mathematical impossibility of our empire's survival without immense suffering, became an undeniable, concrete fact. It was a highly regrettable realization, because the true horror of the Valerian ascendancy was not a sudden explosion of kinetic violence, but rather the slow, meticulously documented suffocation of entire planetary cultures, reduced to mere rounding errors in a vast and utterly uncaring transactional ledger. The wealth of our glittering spires was directly extracted from the crushed bones of the workers we had just left behind. When the tram finally shuddered to a halt at the Royal Transit Hub, the polished white stone of the platform felt obscenely clean. The contrast was physically nauseating. The air up here smelled of synthesized ozone and imported botanical fragrances, completely devoid of the sharp or metallic tang of blood that saturated the lower levels. Kalia stepped off the tram, her ceremonial armor suddenly appearing less like a symbol of divine authority and more like a gilded cage built on the broken spines of her own people. Every step she took across the marble floor seemed heavy, dragging with the accumulated weight of a million unspoken atrocities. She turned toward Julian, her mouth opening slightly as if to construct a hollow defense of her mother's systemic exploitation. The deafening wail of the outer system rebellion alarms abruptly shattered the fragile quiet of the transit hub, drowning out her words. As the blare of the insurrection sirens echoed through the polished marble corridors of the Ascendancy Palace, sweeping away centuries of cultivated diplomatic silence, a Princess Kalia finally abandoned the crippling weight of her complicity and stepped fully into the terrifying light of her own autonomy. The high-pitched sirens pulsed in synchronized harmonic dissonance, a frequency specifically designed to induce immediate biological panic in the civilian sectors, while alerting the heavily armed Praetorian Guard to mobilize across all major transit arteries of the sprawling capital city. The suppressed outer systems had finally ignited. The decades of forced relocations, brutal mineral quotas, and systemic cultural erasure had reached their absolute breaking point, collapsing the fragile perimeter of the Queen Regent's authority in a matter of minutes. Because survival. That was the only currency the lower tiers truly understood in the dark. Julian looked toward the Capitol spires, his expression hardening into a mask of pure, unflinching resolve. He did not wait for an official ascendancy escort to guide him through the lockdown protocols. He simply bypassed the stunned palace guards and began walking directly toward the military command wing, fully intending to place himself between the wrath of the ascendancy and the fragile rebellion of the outer colonies. Kalia watched him walk away. Her bioluminescent ridges flickered weakly, struggling to cycle through the complex biological markers of profound shame and absolute awe. She was completely undone. The human had taken her carefully guarded autonomy, a theoretical concept she had wielded only as a passive shield against an arranged marriage, and forged it into a kinetic weapon. For he had shown her what true power looked like when it was unchained from the suffocating demands of protocol. The rebellion in the newly incorporated outer systems fractured the capital's silence just 3 days later, dragging the entire Terran delegation into Queen Regent Vespera's High War Council chamber. Julian Vance had already delivered his ultimatum. He had explicitly threatened to void the United Sol Federation alliance, rather than condone the Queen's immediate, overwhelming military crackdown. As his heavy footsteps echoed against the polished marble floor toward the exit, I found my gaze inexplicably locked onto the slow, rhythmic blinking of a green diagnostic light on the underside of the central holographic projector. It pulsed every 3 seconds. An utterly irrelevant mechanical heartbeat in a room where millions of civilian lives were balancing on the edge of a kinetic blade. Queen Regent Vespera commanded her daughter to bring the human to heel, her voice echoing with centuries of unquestioned dominance and cold transactional logic. Princess Kalia stood up slowly. She physically regressed, snapping her spine perfectly straight. She aligned her chin at the exact 20-degree angle mandated by centuries of royal protocol. She assumed the flawless, terrifying posture of an ascendancy monarch about to pass bloody judgment, hiding behind the impenetrable armor of her ancestors for 5 agonizing seconds. Then she broke it forever. Kalia turned her back on the throne. She stood before the furious council, her bioluminescent ridges burning a steady, unyielding gold. She publicly severed all ideological ties with her mother, her voice ringing out with a cold, devastating clarity that paralyzed the Praetorian Guards. She explicitly demanded the immediate deployment of humanitarian negotiators instead of warships. Centuries of tradition, gone. The princess had weaponized her own carefully preserved autonomy, aligning her entire political existence with the unranked civilian advocate who had refused to bow to her crown. The room remained suffocatingly silent. They did not look back. I filed my final observational log under a permanently restricted classification. Kalia had intercepted Julian in the diplomatic wing, standing near a heavy travel trunk bearing a jagged scuff mark on its left edge. The ruggedized data pad, once a forbidden ledger of civilian grievances, now rested across their joined knees. Its screen glowed softly in the quiet room as the two equals began drafting the unvarnished humanitarian reforms of a healing empire.